to thank Last Word for generously providing the space for us this evening. So support them generously. This event, in addition to being an opportunity for Scott to promote his book and whatnot, it's also a fundraiser for Free Radio Olympia. If you'd like to purchase one of Scott's books, he's graciously donating $5 from the $20 cost every book to Fro. For those of you that aren't familiar with Free Radio Olympia, it's the local community pirate radio station. It's been active since 2001. And I think one of the reasons I really like to see people support Fro is because it's an excellent example of the kind of thing Scott's going to be talking about tonight when he talks about dual power. You know, there's a group of activists came together. They decided that they didn't like corporate media. They wanted an alternative. So rather than begging for an alternative or whatnot, they went out, they created a community radio station, put it into action, in defiance of FCC regulation. And I think that's a really valuable resource in our community. And Fro's in the process of kind of reorganizing, getting back on the air, and we could really use people's help. So definitely encourage you to buy a book, or also Dean here in the back is selling kombucha, so if you want a bottle of kombucha, all the money from that's going to be going to Fro as well. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Scott Crow, he's a lifetime activist and community organizer. One of the reasons we wanted to bring him here is I think personally he's one of the best voices when it comes to articulating the philosophy of anarchism, and also not just talking about it, but then going out there and putting it into effect in the real world. So with that, let's hand things over to Scott.
Thanks. Thanks again to Last Word for hosting this. I love this bookstore. It's one of the most, I've been to a lot of bookstores, as you can imagine, and this is one of my favorite ones I've ever been in. And I want to thank all of y'all for coming out. And I would say thanks for coming out on a rainy night, but every night's a rainy night, right? So my name is Scott Crow, and I want to tell you, I'm going to talk a lot tonight, a lot about stories, and I want to tell my personal narrative. And I'm going to use my book as a basis to talk about ideas. But my book, I'm not going to talk about the book, and I'm not going to do readings from the book. Actually, what I want to do is talk about ideas about political movements, past, present, and the future. And when I'm going to use my personal narrative, not so that when you leave here you think that I did something great, or that I'm a badass, or that I live this mythical life, but hopefully that you'll see yourselves in these things, and that we see that it takes all of us to make these changes happen. And I'm not an academic. I'm a worker, and I'm an organizer, I'm a father, I'm a neighbor, I'm all of these things. And so when I'm going to give you a little bit of history, but take it that I'm just giving you a little subjective history on how it related to my life, and how these political movements related to my life, and that hopefully you'll see them and see how we build for the future. And the book is called Black Flags and Windmills. And basically, it's the idea that black flags are the flags that anarchists have carried in all of history, that anarchism has been alive since the 1800s. And the windmills part is the part that I have often felt like Don Quixote in my life, where I've been tilting towards windmills. Sometimes I was slaying giants, but often I was just tilting at windmills. And to me, it's the ability to laugh at myself about that and recognize those mistakes. And so that's kind of where that's all coming from. And tonight I'm going to talk about, in all of my organizing and all the political work that I do and in my life, I use this framework to talk about things. And it really is like dream the future, know your history, organize your people, and fight to win. And, oh, please have a seat. Welcome. Thanks for coming. So dreaming the future is about the ideas of that. If we want people to leave the capitalist system, if we want people to leave bad situations, we have to dream of something better. And we have to offer that to people. And so I like to think about that. What does the future look like? And I don't mean a science fiction future on far-off planets and stuff, but a future that we have on this planet and how we take care of it. The other thing is knowing our history. I think it's really important for us as individuals to know our own personal histories. And to know movement histories and political movements, because we're all building from that. Often when people come into movements like in the Occupy movement, how many people here were part of Occupy here? There's quite a few. A lot of times you feel like you're creating something brand new, but really we're reinventing the wheel, or we're building on what's already been there before. And I'll show you an example of that. Is that, like in the Occupy movements, the fact that you would use consensus decision making, the fact that you would use spokes council models, that you would want to have participatory democracy are all built on anarchist work that I participated in the last 20 years. And then it was built on work before us that was done for the last 80 years. But when you got to come into the Occupy movement, really what happened was you got to already inherit those things and build from it and hopefully do it better than we have done in the past as we all want to change this. And organizing your people, that's the thing that we do really well as political activists and political movements. We organize our people really well, but we need to continue to do that. And we need to fight to win. Stop asking for little bits of crumbs, right? We don't, and we want everything. We want it all. And we don't want to take power over others in fighting to win. We want to build power from below in fighting to win. Because we're fighting for our lives and the lives of those we don't even know. So with that, I'm going to start with a little bit of history of myself. I grew up in a rural factory town outside of Dallas, Texas. Not a very radical place, but I knew that something was different. There was something that was wrong. My family was different. Why is it that my dad, my uncles, and my cousins were all in prison? Why is it that drug addiction and abuse was rampant in families? Why was it that we didn't own a home? But I didn't have a language for these things. Why did I live next to a factory? It wasn't miserable when I say all of these things. It's just the reality. But when I saw it on TV, it didn't look the same. It was not Leave It to Beaver. It wasn't the Cosbys. You know? And so I started to figure out things. And I had this innate sense that something was wrong. And I wanted to fight against it, but I couldn't get it along. And to become a revolutionary, which is what I think I am, because I want things to change. It doesn't mean I want to overthrow governments or want us to be violent, but we need to have revolutions. We need to break things down to build new things, to allow new things to come in. That's revolutionary. And it's a lifelong path, but you have to start somewhere. And it takes a long time to get to those things. So in 1985, I quit high school. And I was the first person that was going to graduate from high school in my whole family, and I decided I wanted to quit. And my whole family had a meeting and said, "You can't quit." And I'm like, "I'm quitting. I'm going to quit high school." And I'm talking about my extended family. And they're like, "You can't do that because we have all this hope on you." I'm like, "But this is crappy. I don't want it." So I negotiated with them to go to college for a few minutes. And while I was at college, that's where I cut my teeth on protesting. I cut my teeth on the anti-apartheid movements, where I learned, these apartheid systems that we supposedly got rid of in our country were in South Africa, and we're continuing. And there I am in 1985, rocking a big mullet head right there, chanting. This is my very first protest. It was very funny. And I started between 1985 and 1990 to really work on a lot of things. I was part of an industrial political band. I traveled around the country with bands like Skinny Puppy, Nine Inch Nails, Ministry playing. And we used music as a political platform to talk about ideas, but I was gaining political experience. I still didn't have a lot of political experience in that. I also went to Europe for the first time, and I went into East Germany, and I saw what socialism and communism, which was the dominant political idea even in the United States on the left, I got to see what it looked like. And you know what? It was terrible. It was gray. I saw the failures of communism firsthand in East Germany, and I was like, this is not what I want. And I also saw the failures of capitalism under Ronald Reagan, where I thought he was going to kill us by pushing the button at any moment, and then we're going to be in nuclear war. So we had to find another path, but I still didn't have the answers, but I'm gathering information as I go. And 3 core issues I started to work on. And those were animal rights, environmental issues, and political prisoners. And these are issues that I still have continued to work on to this day. I became a vegan and vegetarian, which I still alternate in and out of, in 1988. And I started working on radical environmental issues and then political prisoners. And it's not a linear path, but things go. And I've worked within the system, without the system. I've voted, I've petitioned, I have run petition drives, I've written letters to corporations. It's so funny to look at some of the published letters that from the newspapers back in the 80s and the early 90s that I had. I was like, oh, did I really write that? But you know what? It's part of political evolution. It's about becoming alive. But there's 3 movements that really that I'm going to distill down. There's lots of things that influence us, right? There's so many pieces that really make us who we are, that bring us to this moment right now. All of our lives, all of our histories brought us to this moment at this second, right? And I'm going to talk about three broad movements that really influenced me a lot and that I think have relevance for political movements of the future. Not because they were perfect, but there's things that they did that we can learn from and that we are doing now. And one of them is the Black Panther Party. And the Black Panther Party was not the first organization to ever take up arms in the United States, but they were the first one to take up arms in defense of their communities and also do these survival programs pending revolution. They recognize that you can't just defend a community with guns, but you have to figure out what the heck's going on. Why are our communities like this? And for them, it was the black community, right? But they also built these programs of education, healthcare, culture, and try to create jobs with dignity, to create this social safety nets. They didn't ask the government to do it, they did it themselves. If they wanted a clinic, they built it in their own communities. And they connected the struggles. Instead of being a single issue that we want to get a right to vote or we want this one thing, they said, we want to fix all of these issues because they're interlinked. And they influenced a lot of movements, the American Indian movement, the Young Lords, the Young Patriots, on up into the 70s, even after they dissolved. And so to me from Texas, that was a pretty influential thing, even though I was scared of them when I was a kid. But I was really lucky because in the early 90s, I started to meet some of these former members of the Black Panther Party, and they started to tell me about these things. I got to understand them and a lot more. And that was a very special thing for a redneck from Texas. And then I'm still growing, and I'm very much into communism and stuff, and that you have to understand that for those who are young, that the communists and the socialists dominated the left from the 50s all up until the 90s. I mean, the anarchism was still in its infancy, even though it had come and gone in these waves. And so in 1994, these indigenous people rose up in Chiapas, Mexico, the Zapatistas, right? And they took the same ideas that the Black Panther Party had, which was survival programs pending revolution, armed self-defense, and they added these other elements of anarchism to it. But they didn't call it anarchism. The ideas of hope, the ideas of dreaming of better worlds, the ideas that we don't have to have the answer. It can be living revolutions. And those are really powerful ideas because it leaves it open-ended. And then we move forward a little bit, and I had flirted with anarchism in the 80s and the early 90s, but I still stayed pretty much within communist ideas. And then in the late 90s, I was reintroduced to anarchism in a whole different way through an old labor organizer named Gene Aikens in Dallas. Take him. Yeah, please. Welcome. And anarchism, when I came to it as an adult, made total sense. It wasn't this crazy abstracted thing of old dead people. It was living. The ideas of mutual aid, the ideas of cooperation, personal liberation, collective liberation, the ideas of direct action, that we can do things ourselves without having to wait for governments or anybody else to do it. If something is wrong, we fix it ourselves. Little a anarchism. And I felt, when I came back to it, I felt like I'd come home. And I'm in Dallas, Texas at this time. And I'm like starting to get information about it. And there weren't pamphlets and zines like there were, except for old ones. Because we're in the Renaissance phase right now of a lot of anarchist literature, which has been really, really fantastic. And I want to talk about some of the common threads between these different movements. Even though they're all disparate and they were not this linear package, I want to talk about some of the common themes in them. Autonomy and self-determination. The fact that each community should determine its own future. Pretty basic. Dual power. Each of these movements propose the idea that we not only oppose, but we propose. That we resist on one hand, but we also create and build on the other hand, and that's important also. The other thing, that participatory democracy, that every voice counts. We don't have to agree, but we should hear each other's voices in making decisions about things and trying to decide our collective futures. Community and self-defense. That doesn't automatically mean guns, but that every community has a right to defend itself from corporations, from governments, from fascist tendencies, anything, that we have a right to defend ourselves. Also, language and narrative. All of these disparate movements had also told us to dream of better futures that were beyond what we had in front of us. They challenged us to look beyond that. Anarchism today challenges us to look beyond that. And they also connected the struggles. Anarchism has a long history of connecting the struggles, just in different ways. Even today, as we're moved to single issues again about things, we want to stop this war. But if we want to stop that war, what about the other war? What about the war on the poor? What about war on women? When somebody says that to me, like, hey, I want to stop the war, I'm like, which one is it? You know? And they connected all these struggles. How do immigration and prisons and environmental issues and animal rights issues and things, how do they intersect? Where do they intersect? And nobody cared about anarchism and its beauty in the late 90s. And there was a rising movement of the alternative globalization movement was coming up. Around the world, farmers were fighting. Landless peasants in Brazil were fighting for their right to determine their own futures, while these big super governmental organizations like the World Trade Organization were trying to take their power away for corporate control. And nobody cared that 500,000 people gathered in Seattle in 1999 until a brick went through a window of a Starbucks. This was the coming out party for anarchism in the United States. It didn't solve the problem of the WTO and the World Trade Organization, but it made front page news. All of a sudden, people wanted to know what neoliberalism was and why the World Trade Organization, the super secret organization, was able to supersede governments in making decisions for people's lives about their food choices, about their water, the privatization of water, the genetically modified foods and stuff. And anarchism began to have the largest sphere of influence in the United States. Communism had failed. Capitalism is failing, and all of a sudden, the people on the left were looking for other ways to do this. The party systems weren't working, nothing was working, and all of a sudden these ideas of decentralized, democratic, participatory democracy started to make sense. And we started to go to these large summits to challenge these things, and we would create these large autonomous zones with tens of thousands of people from around all across. This was happening all over the world, but I'm going to talk about the United States. So now it wasn't just Seattle, it was Washington, D.C., it was in Georgia, it was in Chicago. There'd be tens of thousands of people would gather at these massive summits, and these big temporary autonomous zones would be formed. And it was pretty amazing what would happen with them, because we were tearing down the neoliberal policies and all the shills that were happening on one side, but we were creating mass movements, mass decentralized movements, and not one big mass movement, but mass decentralized movements for the first time in the United States. The other thing that was happening was that I'm going to start going the other way. There was this other thing that was happening, because when these autonomous zones were created, there was things like Food Not Bombs, which had existed since the 70s, which is an anarchist food program, and street medics would start to gather at these things to take care of all the activists and stuff that were doing these things. And there were legal teams. How did I get there? Yeah, there were legal teams. There were all kinds of things. And sometimes when we would leave places, like we'd leave a city after thousands of people would leave, the legal teams would take care of all the stuff. And we would also leave some cities in better shape than when we had gotten there in the first place. Built community gardens that could stay. There was a tent city we built after the Republican National Convention in 2000, because the homeless people there had wanted it. And it was an amazing thing to see, but it would always dissipate, and that would be it, and everybody would go their own separate directions. But these were beautiful structures that were in place in very many communities. Legal support systems and street medics and Food Not Bombs. Anybody here participate in Food Not Bombs over the last years or anything? Know about Food Not Bombs? It's a long-term thing, and so many people have done it. It's been amazing. And in myself, I started working with an anti-fascist organization called Anti-Racist Action. And I was back in Texas, and we would go and we would face off with the Klan and have big fights. And I was also working on a lot of anti-corporate campaigns. But the campaigns that we were working on were not campaigns that were just about going and standing in front of a building and saying, no, don't do that, please don't do that. We started targeting people at their houses. And we said, ya basta, enough, you are not going to do this. And so you can't hide behind a corporate board decision to make this. And I worked in the animal rights movement to do that on a campaign called the Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty Campaign. And our goal was not to build mass movement in that campaign, but to shut this corporation down. And that was the goal. It wasn't about trying to be the friendliest. It wasn't about it was do anything until they stop. So we took that also, and we used that same model in the Dirty South Earth First campaign. And myself and this guy named Rod Coronado, who's a former political prisoner, and a couple of other friends of mine, some of y'all may know a guy named Scott Parkin was another person. We formed this other organization. We used the same thing to support the people in Northern California. We're trying to stop the redwoods from being cut down until there was nothing left. And we targeted these people at their homes in Houston, Texas, where the corporation was. But I'm still like trying to think, like, I'm tired of resisting. I've been resisting for 15 years now, and things are not changing. Even if we drive one corporation out of animal abusers, somebody else is going to be there to take their place. And we stop one company from cutting down trees, somebody else is going to be there to take their place. We have to figure out something else. And I've been thinking and thinking and thinking, trying to figure these things out. And then the storm came ashore in 2005. It was called Hurricane Katrina. Does everybody know about Hurricane Katrina? Yeah. It wasn't the storm that caused the disaster. It was long-term environmental degradation in the Gulf Coast, where they took out all the barrier reefs so they could dig for oil, and they dug out all the rivers to make them wider and deeper so that ships could come through. That's partly it. And long-term environmental degradation. I used to swim in the Gulf Coast to get oil on me when I was a kid. Little tar balls would roll up on the shore pretty regularly. But it was also the levee failure that caused the disaster, right? Tens of thousands of people were left in New Orleans to die. Now, did that have to happen? No, it did not have to happen. And there's a long history of political grafting and taking money when they built the levees. The levee should never have failed. And there's a lot of people that should take responsibility for that. But in my personal story, I've been doing political organizing with political prisoners called the Angola 3. Has anybody ever heard of the Angola 3? Yeah. These guys are great people, good humans, have done amazing things, and they've served the longest time as political prisoners in solitary confinement than anybody in modern U.S. history. The man in the middle, Robert King, got out after 29 years in solitary confinement, 32 years in prison. And the two men, Herman Wallace and Albert Woodfox, are now serving, they're out their 40th year in solitary confinement. Imagine this, living in a 6x9 cell. You're like, well, what's a 6x9 cell? It's probably about the size of your bathroom. And that's what they've been, because of their political ideology, that's why they're there. When King won his Just Freedom in 2001, I started doing a lot of support work for him. And in doing that, I went back and forth from New Orleans a lot and developed a lot of relationships with people. I worked at Critical Resistance there. I worked with local grassroots organizations there on prison issues, around juvenile justice and prison issues. So I'd gone back and forth, even though I lived in Austin, Texas at this time. And I'd lived in Dallas, and then I moved to Austin. So when King was there and the storm came, he said he was going to stay. I said, that's fine. But then the levees failed, and they declared martial law. We didn't expect that. And Robert King was trapped. And this friend of mine, a man that I'd known for since 2002 called Brandon Darby, called me and said, hey, let's go get him. And I was like, no, that's crazy, man. What are you talking about? Like, we're not disaster relief people. Well, how are we going to do that? But I thought about it. I was like, I saw the government failure on TV. This is Monday when they first declared martial law. The storm hit on Sunday. This is Monday, right? So on Wednesday night, we were there. Wednesday afternoon. And what I saw, when tens of thousands of people were trapped on their roofs, I saw the government fighting over who had control of search and rescue boats. Now you have to understand, it's 100 degrees in New Orleans when the sun's shining. There's people trapped on the rooftops. You saw the pictures of it, but what you didn't see were that people were trapped in their attics. You know how hot it is in an attic when it's 100 degrees outside? It's 130, 140 degrees. It's hot, and there's families that cannot get out of them. There's water at the bottom of it, and they can't. Some families could bust their way through, but a lot of families couldn't. It was criminal neglect what was happening, that they left those people in there. Criminal neglect of the government. There's no other way to cut it. And I was furious about it. So I had this idea that we would take a boat, a flat-bottom fishing boat, into the open ocean of the Gulf Coast, and we would come up through Lake Pontchartrain on the eastern side, come through one of the canals to where it had breached the levee. This is the levee that's supposed to protect people. The water is normally way down here, and on this side, it's way down. This is supposed to be about 20 feet right here. That had breached right here, and this is the area you know as the Lower Ninth Ward. Have y'all heard about the Lower Ninth Ward? It became Ground Zero. And this house right here, I want you to pay attention to, because remember that, because you're going to see that house again. This house is a 2-story house. The whole first story, you can't even see it right now. But what started to happen in those very first days was so much confusion and so much racism in this country, which was one of the reasons we got in the situation in the first place. Because they would never let that happen in Florida. They never would have let that happen in parts of Texas. But because it was poor people in the Louisiana Gulf, who cared? In Alabama and Mississippi. And it wasn't just New Orleans that was affected. There was Cajun communities, Vietnamese communities, First Nation communities that were totally underwater along the Gulf Coast that nobody even talks about. So we were going to take a little boat into here to get into the lower 9th Ward and work our way over to Central City to get towards King. It was a crazy plan, but then all of a sudden we started hearing rumors about people shooting at rescuers. And I could see why. One, because people were desperate, but two, because the rescuers were largely white, largely men, and kind of racist towards people. They treated people like cattle. And it was really disheartening to see. And so we had decided that we didn't want to shoot anybody to rescue our friend. So with great shame, what I did was I left. And this is Saturday, 5 days after the storm, right? And when I left, I had a lot of shame about leaving, because I'd never left anybody behind in any action I'd ever left before. And here I was leaving tens of thousands of people in a life and death situation to basically die. Even if I couldn't have saved everybody or helped that many people, I felt like I was taking all these resources of my privilege and leaving. So I get back to Austin, I'm exhausted, haven't slept, haven't ate, my adrenal glands are in full mode. And then this man named Malik Rahim, who I'd also known, who was another former member of the Black Panther Party, who was friends with Robert King from the Angola 3 since they were kids and had been in the Panthers together. He had called me because he heard I was there looking for King. He's like, "Bro, we need some support. We have white vigilantes driving around my neighborhood and they're going to kill me." Now, he lived in Algiers, which was just south of the river near the central part of the city. And where he lived, it hadn't flooded. It had just gotten a lot of storm damage. And basically, these white men in this area had basically taken it upon themselves to protect themselves by arming themselves and driving around in trucks just like the Klan and meting out justice the way they saw fit. And that meant killing people and threatening people. And so when he said he needed support, I knew what he meant. He meant bring guns because we need help right now. And so Brandon and I, the only two people in Austin, we met with a group of people and said, "Hey, does anybody want to go do this? It's crazy, but these guys really need help." Nobody would come. And so just he and I took off again. So on Monday, 1 week after the storm, I was there again. And through a series of things, I ended up in an armed standoff with the white militia. We didn't fire any weapons at them, they didn't fire any weapons at us, but they stopped threatening the people there. It was 2 white guys from Texas and 3 guys from the neighborhood who took great risks to arm themselves against the white militia. It was the scariest thing that ever happened to me in my life, but also one of the proudest moments and something that took me 20 years of organizing to get to. Because it was anti-racist ally, it was one of the furthest things I was willing to do, was to give my life for it. I didn't feel heroic, I felt terrified when it happened. But then, well, I was to say also that during this time, Brandon went across the river and got FEMA to get King at his house and bring him back to us. And when he brought King back, I cried like a baby. Because it was one of the most joyous times of my life, because I thought he had been dead. Sorry. It had been 9 days, and I thought he was dead. And he was a man that didn't deserve to die like that. Nobody deserves to die like that. So when I'd come back to New Orleans, this is what I had seen. I'd seen the militarization that was going on. Still, not search and rescue and helping people, because there were still 10,000 people stuck, but trying to regain control of the city. whatever the hell that meant. People were looting, but it wasn't that widespread, and it didn't matter because they weren't harming anybody. People were starving to death. People needed water. It was hot. So they'd break into stores. The police were looting like crazy. Don't think that the police were not doing it. And then I saw this, the criminalization of people for this. If somebody wants to take something, especially for survival, go to town on it, man. It's a disaster. You've been left to die, go for it. And if you want to grab a TV on the way and you want to carry it across 15 feet of water and swim with it, and you think you're going to go take it to your house where there's no electricity, man, go to town. I'm not going to stop you. It's definitely not worth militarizing and holding people down. And when we got back to Malik's house, this is the first thing that I'd seen, was that there was these two kids came and got us, and they said, there's a dead body down the street, can you help us do something with it? And I found this man, and we covered him up. He was laying here with bullet holes in his body, and somebody left him to die in the middle of the street. Now, who killed him? Was it the police? Was it the vigilantes? I mean, I still don't know to this day, and he was the second dead body I found. By this time I'd already seen lots of drowned bodies, but I had not seen bullet-riddled bodies. And this was the thing that we're dealing with. And when I tell you these stories, I have to understand, I can tell you about how high the water was, 15 and 20 feet in some areas, how houses, whole neighborhoods were underwater, not because they had flooded, but because they got pushed underwater. But, you know, like where cars were flipped over or on third-story buildings. But I can promise you, you cannot imagine the scope of the destruction. You cannot imagine it because it is so unimaginable. But everything that you think that we know about the first world was gone. It's a house of cards, and somebody pulled the cards out, and it fell. Because for hundreds of miles in every direction, there was no help. There was nothing. Because everybody was in the same situation. And it could happen again. But I've been going back and forth in my head, and I'd gone back and forth to New Orleans twice at this time, and it's about an 8-hour drive, and I've been thinking, what would they do in history? What would people have done? What should I do? Because I could see politically in my head, I had this framework, something's happening. There is an opportunity amongst this misery to get people back on their feet. And so I looked into what the Black Panther Party did, and the Zapatistas, and what I would do as an anarchist. And I started to formulate and write these ideas down. And this is on a truck drive when I'm crying and doing things and like thinking about things. And I proposed it to Malik Rahim. And we started an organization called the Common Ground Collective. 3 people. Malik Rahim, this man here who's given his life for justice. He's in his 60s and been working for social justice all his life. Sharon Johnson, a warrior who nobody's ever heard of, who did so much work. She was a bookkeeper before we started the organization. And her and Malik had stayed in the storm together, and then my old knucklehead self. The 3 of us started an organization, and this was the organization we started, the Common Ground Collective. And the ideas were very basic. Solidarity, not charity. The ideas based on mutual aid. Hi, welcome y'all. Mutual aid, direct action. And what we would do is we would take, like the Zapatistas, we would lead by obeying. We would lead by asking. We would say to communities, what is it that you need? What can we do to build your political power? What can we do to support you so you can get back on your feet to do what you need to do? And when we asked that question after the self-defense stuff, the very first thing that anybody said was this lady said to us, can you get the rotting garbage out of the way? Because I thought it was going to be a really difficult question. Like when we gathered the first residents together and said, what can we do? I was like, oh my gosh, they're really going to lay some heavy stuff on us. And they're like, can you just get the rotting garbage out of the way? And we're like, yeah, we can do that. So we started that night and we moved it down the street. Because it was getting putrid. But remember the things we were talking about earlier, like food not bombs, street medics, all these temporary things. Could street medics form a clinic? Could a clinic become a hospital? Could Food Not Bombs begin to serve food long term and maybe start a worker co-op restaurant? Could they get a permanent space and have a place to feed people for a long term? Could legal aid become long-term legal support? Could we use ideas of civil disobedience to really challenge power? And one of the other ideas that we took from the Zapatistas was to create an autonomous zone. It's an anarchist idea also. And the original idea was that we were going to take this neighborhood of Algiers, about 6 or 8 square blocks, and say this is ours. And that we were going to provide support for these people and then start working in different neighborhoods. Now that didn't happen, but that was the idea. And we began to delegitimize the state by the work that we would do, and we refused to work with the government. And for that, we were penalized. On 3 separate occasions, 2 times New Orleans police tried, I thought were going to kill me, and 1 time Homeland Security I thought was going to kill me. And when I say kill me, I don't mean in a metaphorical way. I mean when they lay me down, face down on the ground, put guns to my head, so we're going to blow your fucking brains out. That kind of kill me. And that stuff messes with you. I mean, I have post-traumatic stress from all the violence. It took years to get over that, but that's a whole other story. But there was a beautiful thing that happened. The ideas of possibilities began to emerge, even amongst some of the most horrific disaster we've ever seen in this country. And people like yourselves came because they were inspired, because we told this narrative of building revolution, not political revolution for ourselves, but building revolution from below, power from below, grassroots, connected struggles from below to help communities do it. And people started to come. We started with $50 from people like yourself who had started to give money, and we raised $3 million over the next 3 years. None of it went to administrative costs. Nobody got paid. Everything went back into programs that we're doing. We tarped houses. We fed people. We built community gardens. There's a lot of things that we did. But it was the stories of hope, the stories of possibilities that brought people there. And I don't mean Obama hope. I'm talking about hope, people. The part that runs through the eternal hearts of ourselves, our emergency hearts, these beautiful things that we have that that drive us to make change. These beautiful things that we have, the things that give us compassion. And so we started with aid distribution. You know, that was one of the simple things that we did. We opened up our first clinic 12 days after the storm. We provided legal aid for people because scummy landlords were evicting people. There was so much bureaucratic red tape already in the early days. We provided legal support for that. And people like yourselves came to the Gulf. 27,000 people just like you came because they saw this as a chance to do something for people they didn't even know. How powerful is that? That's powerful. And we also would break the law for the higher moral law. As my friend Robert King says, you cannot confuse legality and morality. And not only were we willing to die for what we believed in, we were also willing to break the law and use civil disobedience if we needed to do it. And so part of that was that scummy landlords, in October of 2005, when people were still displaced across the country, were trying to evict people. And so what we did was we started un-eviction teams. So when they kicked them out, we moved all their stuff back in. If they disconnected electricity, if somebody had it, we would reconnect the electricity. And we did it repeatedly. When they came to bulldoze houses in October and November of 2005, you understand that people are spread across the country, have not seen their houses, can't even get back because the government spread them out and they have no idea how to get people back. And then like saying we're going to mow your house down? What is that? So we stood in front of the bulldozers and said, ya basta, enough, you will not pass. And they stopped. Now I wasn't there for everything. The we I'm talking about is this collective we, the we of all of us, right? And so one of the things that we did was in the lower ninth ward when we first moved in, this house behind us, this woman who owned this Doris Cager invited us to this house. She said, I saw the work that you're doing, I've heard about the work you're doing, I want you to stay in this house. And at the time, you have to understand one of the laws that we were breaking too is they built barricades around neighborhoods to starve the people out. That was the first neighborhoods we would go to clandestinely bring food lines into those people, to bring medical attention to those people. So we occupied the house. Some activists occupied the house. When Homeland Security came and arrested people and got them out, we came back in again. When they arrested those people, we came back again until we stayed here. And they let us do it. We started a distribution center here. And then we started to help from the heart of the lower ninth ward to give people hope, to give them help. And we used our white privilege to do that. Our privilege of being able to get the media to pay attention to the plights of people without just talking about poor misery stories. And we built stories of revolution and stories of hope. And we provided legal clinics. We gutted hundreds of houses. Here's some of the things that we did. We used basic ideas of direct action, mutual aid. The idea in mutual aid is a really simple idea of cooperation, that I want something good for you, and I hope that you want something good for me, and let's work together to make that happen. organizing, good old community organizing and outreach. And we built communication centers that were open source. We had wireless networks going because hackers came down and basically built open source networks, and we had Wi-Fi networks throughout Algiers and the lower Ninth Ward in the first 2 weeks before FEMA and Red Cross had them in those areas. Food Not Bombs, legal support, eviction defense, service work, women's shelters. We built women's shelters to give women a safe place, women and their children a safe place to stay that was separate from all the major housing so they could have safe places. Gutted houses. We did food security. We built community gardens over the next couple of years so people could start to have food security in their neighborhood. Community defense, food and water distribution, and cop watch. We also monitored the police because the police were out of control. They were arresting people for being out after curfew. They were arresting people for jaywalking. They were arresting people for being drunk. And everybody, when they locked them up, they just disappeared in this thing called Camp Greyhound, and then they were taken out to prisons, even though they were holding them as jails, and nobody knew about it. And so we brought those plights to the surface, and we built community gardens. And it wasn't all perfect. It wasn't all hunky-dory, because any revolution only looks good in the rearview mirror, right? There was sexism in the organization. There was patriarchy amongst the organization. Brandon Darby got a lot of protection for his activities, which I'll talk about in a second, because of all the things the state was doing to us to shut us down and to injure us as an organization. And racism was. Even though we had anti-oppression analysis and a cultural liberation that we wanted, and we offered anti-racist trainings, everybody brought their privilege as they came in, and we had to deal with that. It wasn't perfect, but nothing ever is. It's always got rough edges to it. And there's some people I want to talk about really quickly who are core organizers, because I wasn't there the whole time. I just helped build the framework and helped get it going, and then came in and out. And I actually became a ghost in the machine. I became kind of a bureaucrat in some ways. Oh, so sad to say. Facilitating meetings and stuff. But Lisa Fithian, that some of y'all may have worked with in the Occupy movement, is one of the key organizers that's there. A man named Sunseer Shakur, Emily Posner, Jackie Samel, Jinka Soderberg, who's in Portland, Brian Frank, who's also in Portland, and Carol Dyer, who used to live here a long time ago, were some of the people who were core organizers. And you have to understand that at any point on any given week, we might have up to 5,000 people on the grounds. We'd have 150 programs going at any time. And then eventually, it turned into more of a traditional nonprofit. And that was due to the large industrial complex, the way the activists start to move on from things, and radicals start to move on to other things that become more important to them. And instead of having 500 or 5,000 people in any given week, we started to have 100 people and way less money. And we work on a lot of wetlands restoration to try to restore the Gulf so that storms can't come in a lot further. And you remember the house I showed you earlier? That's it right there. It's now Common Ground's headquarters in the lower Ninth Ward. And this was, the water had been up to here and that. So, and this is about 10 feet right there. And we're helping to build 32 new houses. There's 32 new houses in there. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it was a small, lower Ninth is not that big of an area. And we help to give people hope in that. We've also formed worker cooperatives and teaching people how to work. How to do construction work, and then they can go out and start their own businesses. And I don't have much to do with Common Ground these days, except for talk about these ideas. And for these things, and for all my political activities, I was labeled a domestic terrorist by the United States government. Yeah. And I first found out in 2006 that I had been labeled this, and I was told by the district attorney of Baton Rouge that I was a domestic terrorist, environmental extremist, and animal rights terrorist. And it started this whole journey because I wasn't charged with anything, but they could spread this rumor around to different police forces around the country. And so, like when I'd get pulled over, I'd be taken out of the car at gunpoint, and I didn't know why. It's like, I'm not a terrorist, I didn't do anything, because they were scared of me, because the FBI made them scared of me. And in 2006, Brandon Darby tried to get me to burn down a bookstore in Austin, Texas called Brave New Books. And a lot of things had happened. And then finally, in 2008, the Republican National Convention in Minneapolis. Did anybody go to the Republican National Convention in 2008? All right. My friends Brad and David ended up going to prison due to an informant that was amongst them. And that informant was a man named Brandon Darby. He set my two friends up, Brad and David, who built Molotov cocktails, decided not to use them, but he had already ratted them out to the FBI. And he had been encouraging them along the way. He didn't make them build them, but he encouraged them by telling them they were wimpy if they wouldn't do things like that. He used machismo. And that was what I was talking about, that Brandon got a lot of protection in. Because we had internal problems with him at Common Ground, but we didn't air them to a lot of people because we were worried it was COINTELPRO, that people would use, that the government was using tactics against us, and we had so much stress already. But through all of this, some documents were released in David McKay's trial, and I noticed that in those documents that there's a lot of names that were listed of my friends, and they would tell about each of my friends that were in there. But then they listed my name, and they didn't describe me, they didn't introduce me, they just started talking about me. That told me there was more documents. So through a long process, we did a Freedom of Information Act request. And I got 600 pages of 1,200 pages of documents that were gathered from the FBI. I was under investigation for 10 years as a domestic terrorist. The first time I'd ever heard the words domestic terrorist was in 1999 when there was some vandalism that happened in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. There was animal rights stuff where locks were glued on fur stores and they had been spray painted, which I did some of it, but they didn't know that at the time. The FBI came to my work, and that was the first time I heard the words domestic terrorist and animal rights at the same time. And I argued with the agent because domestic terrorism, I said vandalism is not domestic terrorism. Releasing animals is not terrorism. And this was before September 11th. Anyway, through all the documents, it turns out that I had 5 informants in my life. That Brandon Darby was just the last one. There was another one named Chris Plummer, who some of y'all may have known, and there was 3 others. They were in different cities who had informed on me at different levels. I can't see what they said because the documents are all redacted. My phone was tapped, my internet was tapped, all my known associates were interviewed. They convened 3 grand juries to get me for this. Now listen to this. I was investigated in 9 states and 13 field offices for arson all across the country. For collecting and distributing firearms to convicted felons. Stockpiling weapons is what they said. I would sound scared. When I read that stuff, I was like, that guy's scary. You know? And the third thing that they said was I was taking international funds and funding terrorism in the United States. Now, you would think, wow, that guy's pretty badass. He's done a lot of things, right? Yeah, I'm not. I'm just an organizer. But really, in the war on terror, they're creating paper tigers. Do you know the idea about paper tigers is where it sounds scary, but really it's just a puppet. There's nothing underneath it. There's nothing to it. And if you're going to have a war on terror, you've got to have terrorists. Yeah? And how many terrorists we have in this country? I can tell you, 4. And of the 500 cases that have been convicted in this country since 2001, only 4 of them, the guy that stuck it in his underwear, the guy that was in his shoe, and then the guy that was in Times Square, and there's one other one, are the only ones who did things by themselves. The rest of them were all either FBI, where FBI informants were part of it, FBI provided material support for it, or they led the damn plot. Every case. But activists are easy to find. Anarchists sound scary. We do destroy windows and break property sometimes. We do burn things down sometimes. But never have injured anybody or threatened to injure anybody, ever. The ALF, the Animal Liberation Front, the Earth Liberation Front have never hurt or killed anybody. But we're targeted because we become the bogeyman. We are the straw man for that. So, who are the targets of this? Really, largely, it's Muslim people and people of Middle Eastern descent. Out of the 500 cases, almost 420 of them are really related to people who are Middle Eastern descent. They are the largest target of this war on terror, and it's a crying shame. Have y'all heard about the Holy Land Five recently? Y'all been hearing about their case a lot? I know 2 of the men from the Holy Land Five. A lot of my friends have gone to prison in the last 10 years for terrorism. And 2 of the men from the Holy Land Five are friends of mine from Dallas, and they're good men. They didn't do anything. They weren't funding terrorism. They were providing support to build education in schools in the Middle East is what they were doing. They were taking money from the United States. It wasn't terrorism. But the next group is animal rights and environmental groups, which we know of as the Green Scare. But really, it's political activists in general, and anarchists in particular. But but I want to put this into scope, that we are a small percentage of this. And that really, if you think about it, that we, even the people who are targeted, who have been grand juried, because you guys have had some people grand juried recently, right? It's a small percentage of all the activist communities that are out there. You have to remember that literally, and nationwide, there's hundreds of thousands of us, of activists, that are doing things at different levels. And that doesn't mean everybody's protesting in the streets, but at different levels, there's hundreds of thousands of activists. Of organizers, there's probably 10,000 organizers in this country at different levels. And this is professional, nonprofit, industrial complex, and also small grassroots. Think about this. How many people have gone to prison in the political movements that we work in? Gone to prison? 10? 20. In the last 10 years. 10 of them have been my friends. More than that, 15 of them have been my friends, or people I've worked with. That's not very much. But the idea of fear works way better, right? If somebody we know or somebody we hear about is grand jury, that's standard operating procedure for the FBI. They're grand jurying people all the time. They're just outside of political communities, so we don't hear about it. But it scares the shit out of us. So we can't be afraid of it. So let's talk about the war on terror really quickly. There's money to be made in the war on terror by lots of corporations. The budget is now $75 billion a year. 854,000 new jobs. There is Obama's new jobs package right there. It's growing exponentially. 4,000 government agencies have been created or reassigned. They took people out of the war on drugs, they've taken them out of border stuff, and they've militarized them, and they put them under this thing. And it's not just the government that's making money on this, it's private corporations are making money. Where do you think those drones are coming from? Where do you think all those new flak jackets are coming from? Where do you think those cameras that they're getting are coming from? Private corporations are making money hand over fist on this. They love it. They are at it's like they're at the trough and they just cannot get enough of it. And we can't forget that, because we always think it's a government plot against us when we do these things. There is money to be made. And it's a revolving door, right? Like people are coming in and out. I want to talk about this company called Stratfor. Private corporations, which we never think about, and private security firms are worse than the government because they work in these gray areas of security. This activist Facebook for 2004 was a set of documents that were leaked to us because a bunch of us, including my friends Russ and Stephanie here, had worked against ExxonMobil for about 5 years by this time. We'd been protesting at their international headquarters in Dallas. We had been doing a lot of actions around it. And this private company called Stratfor had been gathering intelligence on us. And they had been, and it wasn't just us, it was like at other things. And they were giving this information to the government. And we couldn't do nothing about it. We wouldn't even know about these documents. You couldn't do Freedom of Information Act requests to get these documents. But they weren't just covering people who were going after ExxonMobil, they were also doing it with people that were Halliburton. And it's a revolving door because people who would work for the FBI would go work for these private contractors and they get hired back to work for the FBI as a private contractor. So they're sharing all this kind of information that we don't even know about. And those guys are shitty. So why are they doing this? It's about power, maintaining the status quo as they know it. They have power and they want to keep it. Because there's more of us and we are scared because once things get so unequal, we will rise up and say, ya basta. The next thing is the money that we talked about earlier. But the third thing is the fear. Because when we are afraid, we are doing their work for them. There's not very many of them. If you think about it like a pyramid, all the elites of the world is like a pyramid. They're at the very top and it's really small. And that pyramid's pretty big and there's millions of us. But we don't recognize that we have the power yet. We have to create the power from below. And I think we need to create movements beyond fear. All these things that happen to me and that happen to our friends are scary when they happen, but we cannot be afraid because once we have given into fear, they have won. And when I say that, do not be afraid, I'm not saying daily, because when the ATF was going to kick my door in and they were going to draw guns on me and they were threatening to do it because I would not talk to the FBI, I was afraid. But you know what? Because we have something that they can't take away from us. It's the bonds of humanity, that we care about each other and that we will protect each other, not just in activist communities, but outside of those communities. They can't take that away. And you know what I had? I had 100 people who would come to my house, some that I knew and some that I barely knew, that would be there if the FBI did that. How powerful is that? They cannot take that away. So let's talk about what's next. Let's talk about how can we as activists and as political movements think about creating power from below and rethinking the way our movements interact. I've already talked about a few ideas, but let's talk about some more. And the thing is, I want to open up the ideas of possibilities. I don't have the answers for these things, and I don't want to have the answers, but I know that we are all smart enough and we are all creative enough in every community to start rethinking our movements. And the Occupy movement, it was a movement of movements, is so beautiful in that. It was so inspiring to see it come up, because I felt, even since the anti-war movement, that we were in such a lull, and I was worried that people weren't going to rise up again and really try to take power again and build our power. So again, we're back to this thing. Dream the future, know your history, organize your people, and fight to win. This is a good framework to use, to start from. This is a framework I've used for almost 20 years to think about. And let's talk about dreaming the future now. So one of the ideas that we don't recognize a lot of times as activists and organizers is that our job is to bring radical ideas from the margins to the mainstream. Ideas like that slavery should not exist, and that people are human, that women should vote. Those are radical ideas that at the time people were like, oh, hell no, we can't do that. Slavery has to exist because our economy is based on it, our culture is based on it. And people said, hell no, we're not going to do that. And so they rose up. And one of my greatest heroes is John Brown, as a white man who said, hell no, I'm going to take up arms against this, right? Yeah, right. But he's not the only one. There were so many abolitionists. But now we take it as common acceptance that we can't believe that ever happened. But it was a radical idea. The same with women having the right to vote, or women having any kind of power at all, right? That was a radical concept at one point. So one of the things that we can think about is that we need to shift culture. You know, shifting culture internally as ourselves within movements is the way that we start to shift culture in the broader sense. And I'll give another example, a silly example, is that when I became a vegetarian and vegan in 1988, it was not common. People thought when I said vegan, they thought I was saying Vega or like some kind of, like I was from some planet or something. Especially in the South, you know what I'm saying? But now, like, when some of y'all come up, you can get vegetarian options anywhere. It used to never be like that. That's an idea where a radical concept became mainstream, right? And so we're right here. We're the 2.5%. We're the innovators and the early adopters of these things. And what we are doing is we're pushing ideas that an early majority will get part of, a late majority will get part of, and the laggards will finally that. Now the laggards right here, this is when it becomes law. They're the laggards. All laws that are created come at the end of radical ideas that have been mainstream, and they start to create laws against in them. And all laws, in my opinion, are bureaucratic, arbitrary, and reactionary, and selectively enforced. And I would argue with anybody, even legal scholars, on that name of law. And and here is when the economics comes in, because culture shift drives the change, and then economics comes in to either capitalize on it or to make it happen, like what we were talking about, green economy stuff. And then laws come in after that. But this is our work right here, and look, we've got a big hill to climb. But if we know we have this big hill to climb, we can start to climb it with our ideas and putting it into action. So what we need to do is think about how we can be effective about pushing these ideas so they don't come back on us again. And there's another idea that I've learned more recently, and I'm trying it out on y'all for the first time tonight. It's called the Golden Circle, which is the idea that why do we do what we do? Remember the emergency heart I was talking about, this beautiful, passionate thing that we have that drives us? That is the why we do it. We know a lot of times what we do. We organize, we petition, we protest in the streets, we occupy things. And we can think about how we do those things, like we learn how to organize and stuff. But a lot of times you ask people why they do things, they can't articulate it. about why we do things. And this is really important because the why is what it starts to shape the narrative about why we do things. I can tell you why I'm an anarchist, and that helps you to understand two things. One, I'm not a crazy dude. And two, that anarchism could start to sound reasonable. And you know, there's a lot of more friendly people on here, but I can talk to the person at the grocery store about why anarchism is a good idea, and they're like, well, actually, maybe I am an anarchist. You know? Because I can articulate the why. Corporations use this thing against us all the time, and it's time that we start to recognize this about ourselves and use it for ourselves. If we can get to the heart of why we do things, you know, we want to not just stop exploitation, but we want to create something better, and then we begin the how we're going to get there. And then what are we going to do when we get there? It's going to start to bring more and more people, not into us, but it will transform civil society. So I want to talk about some other broader ideas really quickly. A lot of our movements are about resistance, about struggle. But a lot of times we never articulate what we are for. Right? And the question I would propose to you is, if we want people to leave the capitalist system, what are we going to do? And what I'm going to say is that we should show, right? And we do that like with Food Not Bombs and indie media projects and radio projects and stuff. But we need more community garden projects and things. It's not just infrastructure, but that's part of it. But we need to start articulating as movements and as activists, what am I for? What do I want? Even if I'm resisting, I want to know what I'm for. Right? And I think that if we start to ask that and we start to answer that question, we will start to make long-term strategies as movements that are beyond capitalism as we know it, beyond the power structures as we know them, and beyond civilization as we know it. Because all empires fall. Everything that we take right today, we think has always been and will always be, which is not true. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. It has looked totally different so many times, right? And historically, even in civilization, has not looked the same, and empires have fallen all over the place. We need to think about this. I'm not talking about 5,000 years, but what do our movements look like in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, and start to build for that. Because then we begin to take actions to achieve these goals. We have to stop just resisting things. We must create things that are liberatory, that help people to move beyond these things. And I would say, look at the Christian right. Look at what they have done. Look what churches have done. Not just service work, but they've created whole infrastructures that get people into their things. And the thing is, one of the things that I want to talk about is not, I don't want to convert anybody. Oh, that's awesome.
They were at the Brotherhood earlier.
Right? So is that I am not here to convert anybody, and that we should never look at our political work as conversion, because as an anarchist, that's a bad idea, because that makes us no different than Christian groups or Muslim groups or religious groups that want to draw us in. I don't want to convert anybody. What I want to do, and what I want us to do as movements, is present a set of ideas, a set of practices, a culture that people would want to participate in because it's beautiful, because it means something to them. It has meaning to them. And even the ideas I'm talking about to you tonight, if you don't take anything, it doesn't hurt my feelings. How powerful is that? I don't have to be right. And that takes a lot of weight off of that, right? So take action to begin those. And some of that might mean to stop going to protest. Man, we all know stuff is bad. Who doesn't know? Raise your hand if you don't know stuff is bad. The brother and the sister on the street know things are bad. We don't need to go to protests. And protests are not effective. I'm not saying don't do them, but they're not effective in a propaganda war that is so sophisticated and has so much money. Because giant corporations, when we protest against them, they're spending millions, if not billions of dollars to influence our friends and family against those ideas. At a protest, we need to figure out more sophisticated and creative ways to do that. Now, I don't have the answers to that, but I bet in this room y'all have those answers. In every community, we have those answers. And then the other thing I want to talk about is the idea of dual power. Every action that we take in political movements, and even in our lives, well, I would say in our political movements for sure, it should resist on one hand, but also create on the other hand. If any action that your group wants to take or that you want to take as a political activist doesn't meet that criteria, don't do it. Because you're wasting your time. And you'll end up bitter, or you'll end up leaving the political movements that we have. So every action has to build. And creating doesn't mean creating an institution or building a product or doing these things. Creating can, and the building part can be building power in yourself to feel confident about doing things. It can mean building power for your group or your organization, building power for your community, building power from below. Building power in a campaign. It must build. But in the larger scope, we need to create alternative culture, counter institutions that will also build these things. And we need to think beyond activism. Get out of the ghetto, folks. Let's get out of here. Because we talk to ourselves all the time, and we reinforce the worldview that we already have. You know, I mean, it's nice and it's safe when we have that, and we need those spaces. But it's good to get out and talk with people who aren't there. What do the people at the grocery store think? What do the people at the gas station think? What do the librarians think? And you know, like if you live in a really radical and liberal city, get the hell out of your liberal city and get to the rural area and find out what those people think. Because you don't have to argue with them because you're not trying to convince them, but find out what the real world's like, because it's not always hunky-dory. And people actually believe a lot of the same things that we believe, or that I'm making assumptions that some of us believe, you know. And think about beyond that. I am not an activist. I have been an activist before, but that's why I actually self-identify as a revolutionary. I am not separate from these other things. I told you earlier, I'm a father, I'm a neighbor, I'm a worker, I'm also a jackass. You know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of things that I am, and an activist is not one of them, right? So, there's some other ideas. Let's connect our struggles again. Anarchist ideas do that really, really well in the analysis, but how does it look? What if we started, you know, even if universal healthcare really gets going in this country, we still need little local clinics. Everybody needs food security. And if you don't need it, then you need to help somebody else build it for themselves. You know, how do we protect immigrants? How do we give them support in what they do? How do we start to break these things down? How do we stop exploiting animals? How do we stop exploiting the planet? How do these things relate? How do we start to connect struggles that make sense about this? And I'm saying, look back to the Zapatistas. They're not perfect. I wouldn't even hold them up as perfect, and they wouldn't want us to. But you want to create a world where many worlds fit. And widen the mirror of reflection, like I was talking about. Talk to people outside of your comfort zone. Go out and meet people and find out what they're talking about. And maybe you might learn something. Don't convert them, but talk to them and find out what they're about. And recognize that since the late 90s, we have become a movement of movements. The idea of the civil rights movement or this one movement is dead, dead, dead. We are a movement of movements. And what's beautiful about that is it doesn't mean that we have to be more sectarian and more isolated, is that we have more flexibility to do things. And that these currents are actually interwoven and very powerful, even if they're autonomous from each other. So think about this. Instead of all of us getting into one big giant boat and heading towards the dream of the future, right? What if the horizon is over there instead of getting in one big boat? Where I actually don't want to get in this boat with a lot of people because actually I don't agree with them on a lot of things. What if we said, let's get in a bunch of boats. And some of them are going to be big boats, some are going to be little handmade rafts, some of them are going to be sailboats, and we help each other get across. Some boats are going to get there faster, some are going to get there slower. But we don't sink each other's boats along the way, even if we sort of disagree on things. How powerful can that be? We're all going to get there, and we're going to create this better future. And I think recognizing a diversity of tactics is a really important thing. Diversity of tactics is a phrase that's really come into play in the last 10 years. And some people associate it with only property destruction. But it's really the idea that nonviolence is not the only answer. Nonviolence is an answer towards a better future, but it is not the answer to the future. You can ask the Zapatistas about that. You could ask the Black Panther Party about that, the American Indian movement about that. You could ask liberation struggles. That doesn't mean that armed struggle is the answer either, but recognize that it's a spectrum, and it's going to take all kinds of tools and tactics to do this thing. That would include, although I do not participate in, voting. If people want to vote, I support that. Don't try to put a moral overlay and say that what I'm doing is not valid and that your way is the only way to do it, and I won't do the same for you. It doesn't mean I'm going to participate in it, but don't try to do that. It takes all kinds of tactics to make these changes. All right, so some more other ideas. We were talking about shifting culture earlier, right? Remember the idea of radicals are pushing the ideas forward? And also, we need to recognize that we're building the road by walking. If we choose not to be voters and consumers only, and we're on all the open possibilities are in the middle, we're going to be creating the road by walking. And that doesn't mean that we're going to plow it under and just totally concrete it over, but we're going to make some trails. And you know what? Sometimes the trail's going to come to a dead end, and we're going to need to do it again somewhere else. And that's okay. Remember that it's a journey, it's a process. There's no end goal in it, except for collective liberation for everybody. And then I think also remember to be kind to ourselves along the way. You know, my opinions, my ideas, I may think they're important, but if I stop listening to people that are no more important than anybody else's ideas, it's going to take all of us to make these things happen. And I need to be kind to myself when I can't do those things. You know, in New Orleans, I told you, I left in a lot of shame, but I had to learn that it was okay. I had to be kind to myself in some ways, but I need to be kind to others along the way too, even if I disagree with them. And remember to keep it sustainable. If we want to stay in political movements, if we want to make change, it takes a long time. The revolutions I'm talking about, I probably will not live to see. I used to, in my 20s, think that can't happen. It's got to happen right now. And I don't want this reformist revolution, but I recognize that change takes time. And we need to keep it sustainable, because otherwise we leave our movements. And that's one of the hardest things for me, is when people leave. So keep it sustainable. Take care of yourselves along the way. All right, so I'll finish with this. Don't give in, don't give up. Resist, rebel, create, and build. Thank you. All right, so we'll open it up for questions, comments, and concerns. I just unloaded a bunch of information on everybody here. Hit me.
All right, so when you went down to New Orleans, you helped out. How was the being from that part of the state, you know, from Bernice and knowing the effect of the 9th Ward, 8th Ward? A lot of you don't realize that they had a big impact. You know, how many local artists came down to help you out personally?
Artists
or music individuals actually came down.
A lot of artists came. A lot of artists came. You know, and it's interesting because they built, one of the things we started was free schools. I need to put that on the list. We built free schools, and a lot of artists came and helped kids, because there weren't kids for a long time. We actually didn't see kids for, like, very many kids for about the first 6 months. But then they started to come, and we started to have these free schools with them, and and part of that was artists would come and help them do things. Then people started doing murals on the side of buildings and stuff, talking about hope and liberation and trying to rebuild their city. People wanted their city back so bad. No matter how shitty it was for so many people, they wanted it back, and they deserved to have it back. And artists really helped a lot with that. Musicians, I can't speak to so much because I didn't interact with a lot of them, but I know a lot of musicians came back to do things.
Right.
I think Wynton Marsalis or Brandon, which one of those two helped a lot. They have a musicians village there. You know, I was just back in New Orleans 2 weeks ago for the first time since 2008, and it's beautiful. The city is vibrant. There's a lot less people, and it's way more white, but it's very vibrant. Even in the lower 9th Ward, it's way more vibrant than it was. And in the 7th Ward, Holy Cross was the only other place that I went to. It was really beautiful. So, yeah.
So have you experienced the 9th Ward, the 8th Ward, or the 5th Ward before Katrina?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And 9th Ward,
in your opinion, how is it different from before the Katrina till now?
Well, okay, so the sad part about what's different is that New Orleans is a really interesting place because it's one of the few places in this country where you have intergenerational housing, which means that it's just passed on from family member to family member, and it doesn't really change hands. So, like, it might go from a mother to a son, to a son, to a child, and that's gone.
It's food stamp land.
Yeah, well, that's definitely true. So that's gone now. That's a sad thing. That's one of the horror stories of New Orleans, is that a lot of people, their houses were only worth $10,000 or $15,000, but they'd been in their family for 100 years, 150, 200 years. Not even, you know, I'm talking about a shack, you know, and when you know, they didn't have insurance, and they also a lot of times didn't have titles to their houses, and so a lot of people suffered. So that's the one part. But like in the lower Ninth Ward, there was like like a little shack, and literally, I say this, I don't mean this in a demeaning way. It's really were a lot of shacks, like because they could barely afford to keep their houses up, but they were proud of their houses. They had a home, right? So what's happened now is that we this actor named Brad Pitt, y'all may have heard of, started this thing called the Make It Right Foundation. And so like being in the lower Ninth Ward now, there's all these crazy contemporary modern houses all in there, but there's like 200 of them in there, and all these families that used to live in these little shacks are now living in these beautiful houses, and they're very, very happy about it. But there's large emptiness in the neighborhood. All the houses that were there have never been rebuilt yet. It will take decades for that to happen, if it happens at all. And a lot of people didn't come back to Lower Ninth. They chose to move somewhere else. Some of them moved to Holy Cross. Some moved to the 7th, and a lot of people moved out, like up in the Metairie and stuff.
Like you said, like a lot of people forced out.
Yeah, totally forced out. And in the diaspora, you understand that, we always talk about, like, in the conspiracy world, they talk about these FEMA concentration camps they're going to put people in. Man, there ain't nothing like that. Because otherwise they would have put people in it because they had nowhere to send them, so they just sent them all over the damn country. And that's been a real interesting thing, because I don't know if y'all got any evacuees from here that lived here, that moved here. Are you?
No,
okay.
No, I just got family and I know
about. So, and that's a real mixed bag, because I know a lot of people, like in Austin and in Texas, like for some people it was terrible because they couldn't go back, because they had nothing to go back to, no money to go back. But for other people, it became better. Like Robert King, who I talked about earlier, lives down the street from me. He never wanted to go back to New Orleans. After that, he was like, I've had it. I mean, he goes back to visit, but he never wanted to live there. He lived in Center City, and there's violence all around him, but now he lives in a largely low-income and middle-income neighborhood that he likes. He has a house that he owns for the first time in his life, And there's a lot of stories like that where people, it's just a mixed bag for the people who are spread. Like, they did better wherever even if they ended up in Iowa or crazy places that you never would have thought about. Anybody else? Questions? Yes?
About 12-ish years ago, when George W. Bush became president, I had about $100,000 to my name from an inheritance. It ended up going to rent and a failed small business. But it came to my mind at the time that if I had invested it in the war machine and made money and taken whatever profits I got and given it away, if power didn't corrupt,
right.
I couldn't bring myself to do that.
Right.
I couldn't bring myself to get involved in that nonsense at all. But I'm not very business-minded. I kind of float through life, like the Van Halen song, I live my life like there's no tomorrow.
Right. And America wants it that way.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm their poster child. So, since I'm not very business-minded, where should I put the money? If not the war machine, where should I have done it so that I could at least make a simple living? I don't have kids. I don't have a lot of bills.
In your Nike shoebox and bury it deep.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
I live in a van. Down by the river!
The thing is,
make that joke before anyone else does.
Right. I don't have the answer. I can tell you what I did with my money is I bought a house. And, I'm a landowning anarchist. I'm going to tell you that. And I'm okay with that. Because I've had stability to do that. I think a lot of times that's the thing is like you can have a homestead because it's something you can control. It's not an investment that, it's not an investment, but it's an investment in your life, right? It doesn't have to be an investment about making profit. But the other thing is that it doesn't invest in the machine, which is going to, like the war machine or the economic machine. Because once you put money into those things, you don't know where the money goes and what it's funding. Even like friendly mutual funds and shit like that are all crap. They're they're terrible. Or you could have could potentially put it into a local cooperative business, a worker co-op business. That's the thing that we need. We always need funding, and I think worker cooperatives is one of the things that we need to build. We need to build jobs, and the first step that we need to do is build jobs with dignity for people, so we don't have to go work at slave wages at shitty places. How's that when you have economic control of yourself? The things that unions used to provide, now we can do it through worker cooperatives, small businesses that are owned by ourselves that create economic wealth, whatever that means, and is able to disperse the funds to projects that nobody else will do. Healthcare, education, job training, cultural programs, like books to prisoners programs. They're never going to get money from the big nonprofit industrial complex foundation. But how about if a worker co-op funds that, or a group of worker co-ops fund that, and we start our own banks? And I say this because we're still, like, this is transitional, right? Because we still live in a capitalist system. We create our own banks that take capitalist points, dollars, right? But we start to close the loop, and we start trading in localized currencies with about food. You know, it's not just localized currencies, but all these things we start to close them in. And we have our healthcare, our education, our jobs, and our own banking, and maybe it starts to transition out of dollars into silver or seashells or gift economies. But you decide what it looks like. You and your communities decide what it looks like. And instead of having one for Olympia, what if Olympia has 15 different economies there, and all the food is grown within 5 miles from here? And all the currency stays right here. Not a lick of it goes into a corporate entity. It could happen in 25 years. Now, how powerful is that? That would bring the capitalist system to its knees.
How much blood's going to have to be shed to have that happen?
I don't know if it has to be. I don't know. I think it's going to be different in different places, right? Like, so maybe bloodshed in some areas, but maybe some, but maybe some in other places.
We're animals, so it's going to happen. But
I mean, that's always debatable.
Amen. I agree with you, but I'm saying.
Right. I mean, I saw, listen, like, the people who were criminalized in New Orleans, who are the people who were treated as animals, I watched people with nothing, give up their last bottle of water to help somebody. That was anarchy to me. That's the political reference that we gave, was anarchy. I've got nothing. I could die at this moment, but you can have this water because you need it more than I do. I watched that happen over and over and over again. Way more than I ever saw of the thousands of people that I worked with, the tens of thousands of people I worked with who said, mine, 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 me, me, me. It was like, can I help you? If somebody needed help, they picked them up and helped them. And that gave me hope. That gave me inspiration. That people with nothing would give anything that they had to help somebody. Anybody else? This guy.
Why was your informant trying to get you to burn a bookstore in Texas?
Well, I was part of anti-racist action.
Didn't sell his book.
I'll try to make that story really short. I was part of anti-racist action. This bookstore was a right libertarian-oriented bookstore that had a lot of conspiracy stuff. They had a lot of nativist books, anti-immigrant books at the time. They weren't overtly racist because they had books like from Martin Luther King in there. They had books about American Indian movement. It was really interesting. They just were very confused about their politics. And anti-racist action, we had thought for a minute that we might protest them. And it was just before I left Anti-Racist Action, and we decided not to, but my friend, Brandon Darby, had come to one of our Anti-Racist Action meetings and started to really kind of fire us up about it. And we decided we didn't want to protest it because we didn't want to give him any attention. And so later he formulated this plot, and it actually was, what it was is to build smoke bombs, get them in there, put them on timers so they would go off after everybody was gone, set off the sprinklers and ruin everything that was there. Now he was going to provide everything and the transportation to leave, right? And I didn't want to do it. But he also approached another friend of mine to do it who was also in anti-racist action, but we didn't talk. And we didn't know that he had approached both of us to do it. And then later, we were able to find out that he had approached a bunch of people in New Orleans also while we were at Katrina and tried to get them to burn things down.
What happened to him?
Well, he's now a right-wing talk show person in the Tea Party. He goes around to Tea Party conventions talking about how God's inspired him, that he used to be revolutionary and now he sees his ways. He was never a revolutionary. Never a revolutionary. And he was not an anarchist. What he was a political leech. And he absorbed the political language, but never the practice. Right? And he hid in his friendship with me, and I had a problematic relationship with this guy for a long time. The year before Katrina, I didn't even talk to him because I thought he was such a wingnut. So when he called to go get King, I was like, man, can I trust you? You're a nut. And I didn't want to do it, and I did anyway because I wanted to help King more than I wanted to argue with him. So, and the thing is, what I think now, and what I really truly believe about this case with this guy Brandon Darby, is that the FBI, that he willingly went to the FBI and he worked for them, but they manipulated him because they were after me and they were after this woman Lisa Fithian. I mean, I was targeted for 10 years. And so basically, they were trying to get me. They'd been trying to get me. They tried to get me in Detroit and Dallas. And this is not the investigations. This is the informants in Houston. Another informant had tried to get me to blow up statues in 2002. He was going to provide the dynamite. He had the key to the warehouse, and it was these statues of these presidents. And I just remembered what Judy Berry, this old Earth Firster, had said. She's like, you can always tell the ages because they're the ones who want to bring the explosives. And this is when this guy's talking. I could tell this. I'm like, I'm not having anything to do with it. He was a cooperating witness because he had gotten out of prison. And he had violated parole, and he was using it to turn evidence against me. And he actually helped to really criminalize myself and 2 other people that we didn't know at the time, but to really make our lives hell. So, any other questions? Brandon Darby was interim director of Common Ground. Yes, so he politicked on his way back to get into that job. So you have to understand that all this time we had post-traumatic stress, right? There's a lot of things that were happening. Were you at Common Ground?
Yeah.
What year did you come back?
I went down there for 2-3 month periods. So
in 07, so what happened was we kicked Brandon. Thank you, man. Thanks for doing it. You all should give him a round of applause.
So there were assessed like 54 vehicles, repaired 27 that were in Common Ground's fleet the first time, and then I fixed a straight liner truck.
Nice. Thank you for doing that. So Brandon it was really interesting because he liked to sleep with young women volunteers, and we reprimanded him over this a lot. He couldn't do it. And but we didn't tell people on the outside about it because we were worried about it being used against us. And he was problematic in a lot of ways, and he had post-traumatic stress really bad. I mean, we'd gone through a lot of intensely violent things that had happened. I only scratched the surface in some of those. More of it's in my book. And so we kicked him out in 2006. We said, you gotta go. It wasn't like this thing like, you gotta go, you're out. It was like, dude, just take a break, you're done, you're out. I wasn't at New Orleans. I had to come back to New Orleans to make him leave. So he left. And during that time, I started working for the FBI. But we didn't know this, and he started politicking to work his way back in. And because of what he and I had done with the armed self-defense and starting the armed patrols and all of that stuff and coming to rescue King and find King, Malik Rahim had put us and this elevated us to the status above everybody else. Even if we operated in a collective structure with like 30 or 40 different coordinators, we had more power than most people had. And Brandon exploited that a lot. So what he did was he started in 2007, in early 2007, he started politicking to come back in. The organization was almost in shambles. We'd raised $2 million, but coordinators were leaving, people were sick. You have to understand that people were working 12 or 15 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was unsustainable. But we started from scratch. We had nothing, and we built this revolutionary movement. It wasn't perfect. I cannot say that enough. And so he politicked to come back in. And then he proceeded to almost destroy the organization in 3 months. Money came up missing. He started using gun violence against volunteers to get them out, which he said he was cleaning house. It looked just like Stalin. It was weird. He removed women coordinators who had a lot of power. He fired them unceremoniously. And Malik, who sort of backed him at first, was also shocked by all of these things that happened. And finally, it took a couple of months, and we finally got him out again. And during that time, the organization almost collapsed.
Malik was also in a lot of pressure over Tom Pepper.
Right, and then but Tom started to come in, and then Tom helped us to transform to a traditional or a nonprofit organization. And we realized that we couldn't do this collective structure anymore. But it's a long process. But anyway, that's the short answer of all of that stuff. But you have to understand there was a lot of politicking behind the door. And also, I'll tell you another thing that Brandon Darby did that a lot of people don't know is I wrote this very inflammatory letter against another organization that was in New Orleans that was raising funds in our name. And he chided me for 2 months to write this letter. And I wrote this letter, and then we almost started internecine warfare between us and that. I'm talking about gun battles. I was worried volunteers and myself were going to get shot, so I had to go to New Orleans and have a facilitated meeting with 2 people from our organization, 2 people from their organization, and 4 facilitators that took 7 hours to stop making sure that the new Black Panther Party didn't shoot some white random volunteer. or me. I had a bodyguard. So, anyway, but that was thanks to him, and that is total COINTELPRO stuff. So,
that's what I wanted to ask you. What do you think about, well, I know in Dallas it was fairly large. I don't know about here, and I don't know about now. But a few years ago, it was the new Black Panther Party.
Yeah.
What do you think about them, and do you know much about them?
The new Black Panther Party is awful. Can I say that?
Yes, you can.
All right. They have nothing to do with the former Black Panther Party, except for that they have the name Black Panther. They are a crying shame. They are just a shill organization for the Nation of Islam. They do not function in the collaborative nature that the Black Panther Party did. They're reactionary, and they do nothing to build things. And in New Orleans, I read about this in my book, the Chicago chapter, which was a pretty big chapter, came down and scared white volunteers and told them that you should not be here, you should be working in your own communities, and that you don't deserve to be here. This is people who would come to give their lives to do things. And you know what we said to them? Then you do it.
They work with Louis Farrakhan.
Yes. And you know what they did? Nothing. They left. But they threatened us. And the thing is, when they threatened white volunteers who were just nonviolent activists, they were terrified. When they threatened myself, Brandon, and some other people, we said, "Come on, and we'll let's go." We said we actually were ready to get in an armed street battle with them. Now I don't say this bragging because I'm not happy about it, but their politics are terrible. I actually treated them pretty nicely in the book, but they are terrible. And you know, the thing is, they're exploitative because they come into very explosive situations to make media stunts, but they do nothing. They do no organizing. And I'll say that in a broader sense, but there's a bunch of new Black Panthers. There's not just one new Black Panther. There's one that's tied to the Nation of Islam, but there's a couple of other smaller ones. There's one in Michigan and there's one in LA that have actually done some community organizing work. And don't confuse them, but you don't hear about them because they're not on the national news. But the one that's on the national news, what's that brother's name that is the leader now? Oh shit, I can't even remember his name. But anyway, he's a lawyer. And they have nothing to do with working class people. They have nothing to do with poor black neighborhoods. They have nothing to do with anything. And they started in Dallas when I was there, so in the 90s. And you know, like people like Robert King disavow them completely. So.
How do you recognize, like, sometimes it's hard to see your successes, and so how do you recognize successes, and how do you celebrate them even? Like, pat yourself on the back and keep going?
That's a really good question. One of the things that I think that we need to do, remember I talked about being kind to ourselves, is recognizing those successes. It's never gonna be enough, right? If we close an animal lab that's torturing and vivisecting things, if we stop them from cutting down trees, it's never going to be enough because there's going to be trees cutting down somewhere else, there's going to be animals killed somewhere else, there's going to be exploitation of people somewhere else. But we have to celebrate those victories. We have to. Not because it's the lowest common denominator, the lowest bar that we have, but if we don't, why would we want to stay in it? You know, do we want to flog ourselves up the hill all day and go like, man, I should do more, I should do more? That's not a movement. I don't know what that is. It's terrible. But we must celebrate our victories. And this is one of the things that, for a lot of people who are in the Occupy movement, I'm hearing a lot of things that I heard about Common Ground at the time, where people who were in it were totally bitter at the time. And like people who have participated in a lot of Occupy camps are like, oh, there's all this dysfunction about things. But again, revolutionary movements look much better in the rearview mirror. But there's a lot of beautiful things that have come out of the Occupy movement. Tons of beautiful consensus decision making, direct action. There's projects like FRO that's getting built. Worker co-ops. I traveled around the country. All these people who are part of Occupy movements are now building infrastructure and are moving on to other projects. Those are victories, and we must recognize them as such. I think we do ourselves a disservice if we don't. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes.
I understand that you're like an anarchist and everything.
Yep.
But you said you don't vote.
Yep.
Can you explain why?
What I choose to do is work on culture shift, which is the idea of changing our minds about things, and then let other people decide if they want to vote on it or if they want to work on legislative action. Again, I'm not trying to stop anybody from voting. I'm not even ideologically opposed to voting. I just don't participate in it at all, because this is what I do. What I say about voting is really easy. If you do nothing else in this world, then you should vote. How hard is it to push a fucking lever? Right? Or to punch a Chad or whatever it is. It takes an hour, right? But if you do other things, you're not morally obligated to vote also. And I have definitely problems with voting, but I have problems with with political protests and political movements. But it takes all this diversity of tactics, takes everything. We need people suing corporations and suing governments to do things. We need people voting on legislation, local things and ballot initiatives. But we also need people in the streets doing things and building these other things. It takes all of us to do this.
Would voting be contextual? I mean, the Zapatista community vote for the Olympia over here now that they've created, and they do it every 3 months so that nobody gets too encrusted in government and everybody has to learn the problems of going and dealing with external relations that the communities have to deal with.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Speaking of voting,
yes.
The protesters are signs, or that's for something going on right here in the county, this county we're in,
okay.
where we're turning the electric utility, which is owned by a multinational bank out of Australia and Canada, into a locally owned PUD. And 55% of Washingtonians have these now, are on PUDs, and they're paying 10 to almost 60% less for their power. It's like a no-brainer. It's called Prop 1. It's the yellow signs and stuff.
Right on.
We might end up spending 20 grand in this thing with volunteers. They will end up spending $250,000 on these things.
Right.
They're over half by now.
Right on. Right on.
And we still got a week to go.
All right.
So yeah, running out of money.
That's right. Any other questions or comments? Yes. And then
Scott, can you take cash or can you pay here through the bookstore?
I'm taking cash. If you want to buy one through the bookstore, they'll probably take it, and we can sort that.
Yeah, we can figure it out.
Okay. Yeah. Absolutely.
All right.
Yes. Sure.
Just wondering if you have any thoughts about the debate that's going right now on the left about the role of the black bloc tactic and the quote-unquote black bloc anarchists within the movement.
We've got to respect the diversity of tactics. All right, but if the black bloc is a tactic, are people familiar with the black bloc tactics here? Do we have to? Okay, so let's talk about that. It's a very effective tactic in some ways if it's strategically used, right? I've been part of many black blocs over the last 2 decades. I think they have a time and a place. They are not the movement, and they are not a strategy. It is a tactic, so recognize that, one. 2, in any strategy that you build, when you have, and if you're going to use this tactic, make sure that you do it responsibly, right? So I support property destruction, right? That doesn't mean that I'm going to break the window at somebody's house, although I might if they're a Nazi and they're threatening to kill me. But there's time and a place for property destruction, right? But that also said, if I'm in a protest and we have not agreed to anything and there's no goal in it, and somebody stands next to me and throws a brick through a window and I take the rap for it, I'm gonna get them, right? There's no responsibility in that. Anytime that you're going to do that, and black bloc is not always about breaking stuff, but also recognize that it's just a tactic and it has limitations to it. But as a tactic, it's also not violent. To me, it's the new straw man of the violence versus nonviolence argument that's been going on since people have been rising up to fight oppression. And recognize this: there is no violence versus nonviolence. It's a spectrum. Even the most violent, nonviolent pacifists are agitating and causing some levels of violence, right? And I think once we recognize that, because once you start to resist the status quo and you start to resist power, power sees that as a violence, as a challenge, as usurping of their power, and we need to recognize that. And so I think it's a non-argument, and it should be a non-issue. But also, I think that we should recognize that we need to have responsibility in any black bloc, any tactic that we use, that we have to have responsibility to those that are around us, to our broader movements, and to each other.
interpret it as being something that the police might do? Or co-opted by the police?
Right, maybe so. I don't want to get into a big discussion about Black Flag. I do want to say really quickly that if you have more questions or if you have any other comments, you can find me on FaceCrack. You can also find me on Twitter, and you can go to my website and find my email address. And I love to keep conversations going about things, even though we are not going to be able to solve all the problems now. But what I would hope is that you start to having Quinn throws in your own community to start to ask yourself new questions and start to challenge your standard beliefs about what our movements are. All right? Thank you so much for coming out, everybody.